Hey guys, happy summer. This is Mr. Mullen and I will be your tour guide on U.S. history. I have a bachelor's degree from Cal State Fullerton. I have a master's degree also from Cal State Fullerton, one in history, the other in education. I am a published author when it comes to the Cold War in U.S. history. Ask your parents, it was a thing. And I've been teaching here at Native for several years now. I've been doing APUS for several years now. Now that I've introduced myself, let's go ahead and start the story of U.S. history. It is much more interesting than me. That's a lie. All right, here we go. Since we have the time, because it's over the summer, let's go ahead and go all the way back to the very beginning. Except historians aren't really quite sure when the actual very beginning is. We're pretty sure that the very first Americans actually traveled over the Bering Sea Bridge, as it was known. Essentially, what had happened is that we were in a previous ice age, and the ocean levels had dropped because so much of the Earth's oceans were trapped in ice, basically as ice, I should say, and it made it easier for nomadic people, mainly coming over from the Siberia region, to follow big game and animals. Essentially, there is this 100-mile wide gap between what is now Russia and what is now Alaska. At this time period, that gap was essentially easy to walk over. You can't now, that's where the deadliest catch people are. But that is essentially what you could have done back then. And that is essentially how we believe the first humans made it here to what is now North America. We guesstimate this happened between 33,000 and 10,000 BC. But the thing is, what's interesting, in fact, as I'm recording this, there's been some new information to come out saying that maybe these people got here even earlier than that because we have information and we find relics in beaches along the coastline where we have no other evidence of Native Americans being there at that time period. So I think they just found something off the coast of Florida that shouldn't have been there from whatever time period. So again, interestingly enough, turns out that maybe these natives got here even earlier or were able to travel much further and faster than we originally believed. Regardless, uh, by the year 12,000 BC, regardless of when these humans got started, we actually have found human remains all the way down off the coast of Chile. So, from whenever this process started to about 12,000 BC, you could assume that what is now North and South America have been somewhat inhabited, mainly along the coastline, but there's reasons for that. But then again, those are the first natives, the first Americans, we should say. Studying Native American history is very difficult because Native Americans have a oral tradition rather than a written one. So stories are often passed down from generation to generation, which is cool, but it's also very difficult for us as historians because, as you're going to see, what happens when all these Native Americans are dead or wiped out or intentionally enslaved and told not to learn their languages anymore because we want to use them for labor? Like, how do we learn their stories? Unfortunately, as you're going to find out, we don't. Moving on. So, how do Native American societies develop? Well, let's start with the biggest and really the easiest Native American society to start the story with. Let's talk about what's going on in what is known as Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica is basically going to be what is known as Mexico area today. That's a gross oversimplification, but let's keep it easy. At this time period, Mexico is actually a place with a good climate and fertile soil. So, the exact opposite of today. And because of this, is actually going to allow the first Native American societies to actually start developing farming techniques. You learned about this in world history with the development of culture in Europe. Basically, the same thing's going to happen in Mesoamerica. In fact, right around this place called Tenochtitlan. We'll talk about it later. As farming techniques improved, so did surpluses, which led to trade between neighboring groups. Surpluses in food also make it so that way not everybody has to farm or be a hunter gatherer for survival. This is actually going to fuel the development of primitive societies. As these societies and these cities grow, they start to become what we know, what we call chiefdoms, which are essentially really, really large cities. Think of large communities. Eventually, these become empires. So perhaps you've heard of the Aztec Empire or the Inca Empire. That's how they get that name. It started out as a group of people living in a region where they're capable of farming, and then because not every single person needs to farm to feed the entire group, we have other people doing other things, and we have the advancement of society. This is going to be happening specifically in our story in what we know as Mesoamerica. The Aztec society was built on a floating city with massive temples, gold-plated walkways, and nearly 250,000 to 2 million inhabitants. Depends on who you ask. I always err on the side of these societies being larger, simply because it was so difficult to count all the people that were there, and we don't have really accurate records at all. I always err on the side of these being larger. Plus, it kind of makes the story a little more tragic. It was said to be the largest and most beautiful city in the entire world when the Europeans first arrived. In fact, Cortez was quoted as crying when he saw how beautiful the city was for the first time. And then he's going to burn it to the ground. I'm getting ahead of myself. Unfortunately, the Aztecs were also a warring tribe who upset many other local tribes in pursuit of their power. Aztecs also believed in ritual sacrifice to their gods and would often kill members of warring tribes in tribute. In South America, the Incas dominated most of the South American region. Like the Aztecs, the Incas were masters of farming in the difficult to farm and maintain areas of the Andes Mountains. This allowed them to trade and conquer faraway lands, so the Inca have a much wider swath of territory that they control. Now, what about North America? So specifically what we now call the United States. This is U.S. history, isn't it? Well, in the American Southwest, Native American tribes were not as large or as successful as their neighbors to the south, mainly because the land in North America at this time period was not as fertile as land further south. Farming in what is now the United States lagged behind South America by several thousand years. North American Native Americans focused more on hunter gathering techniques and living off the land rather than farming, and this is actually going to stunt their growth as large chiefdoms. We don't really have as many large chiefdoms here in North America. It is also important to note there were more animals and natural foods in North America, so farming wasn't as essential as it was in Mesoamerica. Let's move on. So, what exactly did North America look like on the eve of European contact? So, before the Europeans first get here, what did North America look like? And for those keenly following along, that means that we have just covered 20,000 years of Native American history, and I haven't really said anything yet. Awesome. So, if I had to guess, let's just say in the year 1491, what does North America look like? Near as we can tell, the area now known as the United States has roughly 20 million natives living in it. Again, I've heard estimates that go as high as 100 million natives, and I always err on the side of the higher number, not lower. North America is pretty darn big, so I would err on the side of the higher number. But again, it's hard for us to know definitively as historians, and you'll see why. In fact, there are really historians estimate that there are more actual Native Americans living in the what is now the United States, at this time period than there were people living in Europe at this time period, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. However, due to the vast distances that the New World made up, many tribes did not talk or work together. It's very difficult for us when we are studying Native American tribes to assume that they're all the same because they're actually vastly different. Much like how someone from Mississippi today is much different from us normal people here in Southern California, it's the same way that Native American tribes would be. A tribe that is in the Montana region, like the Sioux, are going to be very different from the Seminole Native Americans in Florida. They're just going to be different because there's a different climate, there's different animals. They're 2,000 miles apart from each other at least, and they don't have cars or airplanes, so their contact is going to be very limited. Very few Native Americans are going to travel the very, very large distances because it's not necessary. So, because of that, Native American tribes can't be seen as homogeneous. They're very heterogeneous. They're very different from each other. Um, the general, like in general, you can make some generalities about them, but they're really not as similar as movies would have you believe. Native American tribes are vastly different from each other. However, if we're going to classify some general things about them, what are some general things about North Americans that we can, or sorry, North American Native Americans, that's hard to say, what can we say about them? Well, First, family. Family is very important to Native peoples. Families stayed together in one region for generations. Native settlements were a mix of several extended families living together, and cooperation was more important than anything else in these societies. Next, gender. Males dominated most societies, with the chief at the top of leadership. However, women were seen as more important in their role in bearing and raising of children. Next, trade. Trade and warfare were common among in these communities, but often on a small scale. Wars were common, but they were typically ambushes on one or two people at a time, and rarely was a tribe ever completely destroyed. Same with trade. Everything's going to be on a small scale, not large scale trade like we're going to see in Europe. Natives also saw property rights differently than Europeans. Property was not something that you bought, property was something that you had because you used it. So this idea of buying and selling and owning of land is going to be completely foreign to Native Americans because that's not how they see property. Property is whatever you are using, and it's yours because you are using it. As soon as you are not using it, it's somebody else's. And finally, religion. Most Native groups believed that all nature was alive, and they believed in the spiritual importance of dreams and visions. And to experience this, one of the many ways that they would often do it would be to spend time alone out in the woods, hunting and, in some cases, taking other forms of drugs and hallucinogenic drugs. But that's another story. So that is what North America looked like. Lots of Native Americans, not really homogeneous, very heterogeneous groups. And now, let's screw everything up from this beautiful, peaceful society that we have now built. Let's screw everything up by inviting the Europeans. So, why exactly do the Europeans come to North America? Why do they even bother coming to the New World? Well, the shortest answer, and there are a lot of longer answers, but the shortest answer here is actually going to be trade. As technology improves in Europe, they're going to start expanding and moving, specifically at this time period, eastward, and they're going to come into contact with the societies in India and the societies in China, and they're going to find all these goods and different ideas and all sorts of stuff when they get there. And soon, the more like the power a country could have would be in obtaining all of those goods that were over in the other part of the world. So that's going to be how a country can basically determine its wealth. If you can get access to all of these goods from India or China and then bring them back to Europe, you could sell them at pretty much what any price you wanted. So that's going to really be what is going to propel and grow all of this technology and this ideas of traveling. The trick was, how do we get to the other side of the world as we saw it then? Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on who you ask, as the Europeans are going to try to do this, they're going to end up going westward and they're going to run into North America, a continent that nobody was sure was there. The logic being, well, the earth must be round, so if we sail from England or whatever in this case and keep going westward, eventually we will hit China. Not quite how it works, but that's essentially what they were originally thinking. So, what compels the entire story, the creation of North America and the United States and everything else, what gets this whole story going? Really, it's going to be this idea of trade. Spain and Portugal are going to be integral to the investment and of making a discovery, mainly because Spain and Portugal are on the peninsula in Europe and they're not going to be able to expand or grow like, for example, a country like France or Germany could. They don't exist yet. But the idea is they really can't expand from where they are. So what they're going to do instead is they're going to expand outward into the world. And that is going to be, they're going to be the ones that are leading the charge. Your book is explaining this better than I am. I'm trying to summarize it. So, why go to America? Ooh, hey, that's a good question. Well, a couple of reasons why you'd want to travel outwards to the New World. First and foremost, uh, Europe's going to go through a time period of relative peace around the late early 1500s. Europe kind of stops fighting each other and they decide to get money instead. Okay, pretty cool. Number two is going to be this idea of competition for foreign resources or trade. Three, there's going to be a religious attitude. So we'll talk about this in a moment, but as countries extend outward, they're basically going to try to take their culture and more specifically their religion with them. Next, we're going to have some better, or sorry, number four, we're going to have some better available technology. Better maps, these things called a compass, a sextant, a caravel. All these things are going to basically make seafaring and traveling easier. So we're going to use that to our advantage. That is a very loud truck. Okay, great. Number five. Um, in Europe, the firstborn son would inherit the job of the father. But what happens if you're a second-born son? What happens to you? Well, good question. There's going to be a lot of second-born sons in Europe that are going to have no inheritance and nothing to do. So, traveling westward is a pretty good thing for them to do. Next, number six, there's going to be the spread of knowledge from the Renaissance and the Gutenberg press. Again, stuff I'm going to kind of skip because I'm assuming you guys learned that last year. If you didn't, well, sorry. Okay, and finally, the real reason there's the big three, as we call them, the three G's. The reasons why people are going to travel to the New World: God, glory, and most importantly, gold. Let's talk about specifically how this is going to happen by looking at some of our early explorers and see what they do. You can't talk about early explorers without talking about Christopher Columbus. You know, the guy that led to the mass murder and genocide of potentially tens of millions of Native Americans in North and South America. Good thing we have a day off to celebrate him. Okay, so Christopher Columbus was the first, and that's in big quotation marks because, he wasn't, to come to the New World, even though he was actually looking for a passage to Asia, mainly because he wanted to avoid the ports and travel through Africa. He was a Christian and wanted to bring Christianity with him. Columbus is more well known because he attached an important discovery to his expeditions, specifically gold. He realized that while he did not actually make it to the abundant resources of China or India, he did realize that wherever he had ended up, he wasn't sure, wherever he had ended up did have something that could be exploited, specifically the gold that was supposedly easily available here, and the natives had no idea of the importance of gold to Europeans. In fact, I'd argue many of them still don't. Um, and he also realized that these natives that he came in contact with were naturally like kind of very submissive. So he realized that they could be exploited for being so submissive. He realized that the real value in the people that he had met was their labor. He's going to enslave, torture, and commit other crimes against the natives that he comes across. And soon other Europeans are going to follow suit. Even though they're not really sure where they are, they do realize that there's resources here to be exploited. Despite discovering, in quotation marks, America, Columbus is a terrible administrator and failed to set up a colony in the New World. He comes to the New World 4 times, but eventually is going to be seen as a broken and mostly forgotten man by Europe at the time period. It's ironic that we kind of celebrate him, in quotation marks, today in the United States, but at the time in Europe, after he made this discovery, like he was kind of seen as a fraud. No one really cared. It also helps that his expeditions were extremely expensive and they didn't really return with any actual material goods right away. So he's going to be extremely unpopular because he was really, really expensive. It didn't actually do a lot of what he said he would do. Let's talk about some other famous early explorers. Spaniard Vasco de Balboa reaches the Pacific Ocean for the first time in 1513. You guys know him because there's a Balboa Island off the coast of Southern California. You guys have been there? No? It's pretty cool. You should go. I grew up around there. Next, Ferdinand Magellan. His ships traveled from Portugal and circumnavigated the globe by the year 1519, which, pretty cool. But of course, if we are going to tell this story, there is no better person to discuss than Hernan Cortez. Uh, let's actually tell his story. As you can tell, it's gonna be a peaceful, happy story. Okay, not really. So, who is Hernan Cortez and what does he do? Now, the story I'm about to tell you is slightly outside the scope of what is pure U.S. history. It is. Like, this isn't really a huge component of U.S. history, but it's a big part of the story of the New World. And understanding what happens in Tenochtitlan, which of course is what you guys call Mexico City, understanding what happens here is going to be integral to understanding what actually happens in the entire story of US history, specifically with how natives are treated. So, we're going to take a moment, even though this is outside of the general purview of US history, this is going to be an important way of building essentially what's happening to Native Americans. Um, Even though we're not going to specifically tell every story about every tribe in North America, this is a pretty good introduction to how natives are treated. So Hernan Cortez is going to come to the New World after Columbus. He's going to come about 20 years later, maybe 30. Um, and he realizes that he needs to find more gold when he comes here. The New World was promised to be a region of riches, but there was a shocking lack of gold in the New World, considering that's what the entire point was. Oh, yeah, by the way, before I tell this story, if you have seen the movie The Road to El Dorado, it's essentially this story. Highly recommended, great film. Um, Watch it right now. I'll wait. Okay, moving on. So, for years, natives on Hispaniola, which is modern day Haiti, told of a city of gold on the mainland, which was now present day Mexico. So, basically, as soon as Columbus first made it to um, the New World, natives talked about this city of gold, this big giant city. Even all the way out in the islands of the Caribbean, this city was known about. So when Cortez is traveling through the Caribbean, he keeps hearing about this island of gold or this land of gold, and he wants to get there. The land of gold they were talking about is actually Mexico City today. So Cortez is going to take 600 men to the shores of Mexico in search of this city of gold because he wants it. His men threatened mutiny against him, so he burned down the ships and told them to find their own way home if they didn't want to follow him. Cortez is a boss. He quickly subdued a rival tribe to the powerful Aztecs. How did he subdue them? Oh, he chained them to the ground and shot cannons over their heads to convince them that he was God. And in fact, that's actually going to be a big way that Cortez is going to gain so much power. He's actually going to he learns the religion of the natives, who believe that his arrival marked the return of a previously departed god called Quetzalcoatl. Go ahead and try to spell that one. Anyway, Cortez, basically posing as a god, and his men are going to be escorted like royalty to the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, which was considered to be the most beautiful city in the world. The Aztec Emperor Montezuma offered the Spanish gold and gifts, but the Spanish wanted more. Cortez and his men are going to invade the emperor's palace, taking all of the gold that was there, and they take the emperor hostage. A big battle is going to ensue. It's not really worth our time, despite how interesting it really is. Look it up. The Aztec defeat is going to be largely due to three main factors. How is it that 600 Spaniards are going to defeat uh, the most powerful army in all of Mexico and the most powerful city in the entire New World? How are 600 men going to be able to do it? Well, number one, Native American spears are going to be no use against the European guns and swords. So the first reason is because the Europeans have better weapons. Number two, natives had not seen horses before, so when they see Cortez riding a horse, they kind of assume he is a god. And if you are living and fighting in a time period where it's all hand-to-hand combat with spears and swords, somebody on a horse is the equivalent to someone on a tank today. So having horses at their disposal, the Spaniards are going to basically be able to imagine, like, I don't know, pretend you're outside having hand-to-hand combat and all of a sudden someone drives through you guys with a truck or something. Like, that's going to make a big difference uh, in the actual little hand-to-hand combat that you're having. Same thing here when it comes to horses. Can't be overstated. But the biggest weapon that Cortez and his men have are disease. The most deadly weapon the Europeans had was unintentional. It was smallpox. Smallpox is highly contagious, and it's transmitted from person to person. At least 30% of those who contract smallpox die within a week. So essentially what happens here is that the Europeans are carrying a disease that most of them are actually immune to, but they're still carriers of it. The Native Americans have no natural resistances to these diseases, and it's basically going to wipe them out. And even The most like perverse part of this is that the diseases that the Spaniards carry are actually going to travel faster through North and South America than the Europeans do. So as the Europeans are traveling, especially by the time that the British colonies are started in North America, the British kind of assumed, wow, this entire continent must be empty. There's like no one here. But see, that's not true. By the time that the British got to North America, 90% of the Native Americans in North America were dead because of diseases that were brought by the Europeans, by the Spaniards, 200 years prior. So by the time, like, let's just say 1650, 100 and so years later, I guess, by the time that the British get there, they just assume that North America is empty and it's basically ripe for them to take. It's not true. Unfortunately, though, all the people that were there are dead. Anyway, by 1532, the Spanish had taken over the Aztec capital city of Tenochtitlan, and they controlled the region for over 250 years. Cortez's tactics are going to be practiced throughout most of the rest of the New World, leading to the destruction of most Native American societies. Spain is going to try to expand northward into what is now the U.S. mainland, but they never find a rumored second city of gold. There really wasn't a city of gold, as it were. They find this one, and they just assume that the rest of the North American continent is covered in gold, but it's really not. Okay, so one of the most important things that you guys need to get from these chapters is how the Spanish, the French, and the British control their colonies differently. Chapter 1 is telling the story of Spain in North and South America because that is actually they're the first ones to really settle in this region. So let's talk about how the Spanish controlled their territory. So the Spanish are going to lose a lot of money originally colonizing the New World. So their goal when they get here and their goal for settlement and colonization is going to be to recoup that money by any means necessary. If this means enslaving the people and making them work in mines like they did in Peru, specifically silver mines, that's what they're going to do. If this means taking all of the possessions of the Native Americans they come across, that's what they're going to do. The Spanish are here for one simple reason: gold. They want money. That's why they're here. They don't care how they treat the natives in the process. Their search after they have taken over Mexico is going to extend to what is now Florida and what is now known as New Mexico. Historical side note, New Mexico got its name before the country of Mexico actually did. Think about it. Anyway, um, they don't find any gold there either. And essentially, it's going to make the Spanish have a more difficult time trying to colonize this region. And in fact, when the Spanish quickly colonized what is now known as Mexico, and they basically crossed the Rio Grande to make it into current day United States, the natives are not as, well, I guess, submissive, peaceful as the Aztecs. They're going to fight back, and the Spanish are suddenly going to face a lot of resistance, specifically in the American Southwest, right around the area of New Mexico. And unfortunately for the Spanish, they don't find another city of gold. So suddenly, all this territory and people that they're conquering, they're not getting any money out of it. And that's the whole reason why they're here. So the Spanish are going to be really, really upset. They realize that, you know what, maybe there isn't any gold here, but there are a lot of people here that can be exploited. We can exploit native labor and we can take all the native land. The Spanish government is going to begin offering these things called encomiendas, which are grants of land and Native American labor, to anyone from Spain who would come to the region and settle there. You guys here in Laverne are living on an encomienda. This town was a Spanish land grant. Another famous area near us is Irvine. Maybe you've heard of the Irvine Company. That's actually was all part of a Spanish land grant. That's part of a Spanish encomienda that was given back in the 15 and 1600s that is still relevant all the way until today. That's essentially what happened here is that the Native American land is going to be taken away from them. The Spanish don't find the gold that they're looking for, but they do find the land and the labor and the people they can exploit. Soon, millions of natives are going to be enslaved, and a majority of the American Southwest is going to be divided up among the Spaniards. There is another lasting legacy of the exchange of goods and ideas between North and South America, there's going to be a lasting legacy of the first European contact. It's called the Columbian Exchange. This is a global transfer of living things between Europe and the New World. Europe is going to bring some things to the New World, like coffee, onions, bananas, grapes, cattle, cows, pigs, horses, and sugarcane. Those are all the things that we are going to bring to the New World. In exchange, the New World gives us things like corn, avocados, peanuts, potatoes, the cacao bean, which of course you guys know is chocolate, and tobacco. It's kind of interesting to think about that we associate potatoes with a place like Ireland, but they don't naturally grow there. Potatoes come from the New World, and if it wasn't for the Columbian Exchange, there wouldn't be the Irish potato famine, and my family would not be here. Which I guess also kind of makes sense because if there was no North and South America, they wouldn't have come here to escape a potato famine caused by North and South America. Sorry, I just blew my own mind. Okay, so it's going to be a global exchange of goods and ideas. You can see a chart here. There are charts online. You've probably heard of the Columbian Exchange before. There's also going to be, besides just like a actual physical transfer of products from the New World to the Old World, there's also going to be a cultural exchange as well. 90% of the Europeans who come to the New World in the first 100 years are male. Many are going to meet Native American women and either raped or, in happier cases, married them. This led to a new group of people who were neither native nor Europeans that were known as mestizos. These are going to be people that have a European, most likely father, and a native mother. These children aren't really going to be accepted by either society, and they're going to cause a lot of problems for both societies. The biggest part of the Columbian Exchange, of course, is smallpox, which I've already talked about. This little girl pictured here has smallpox. That's what it looks like. This is going to kill many, many, many Native Americans. Historians aren't quite sure of the actual total. I've heard totals as high as like 100 million Native Americans die because of European diseases. Um, Again, we don't have accurate numbers, but let's just say it's a lot of Native Americans are going to die because of this exchange between Europe and the New World. We are done with chapter 1. Go ahead and take a break, maybe answer all the review questions for this chapter. Make sure you're reading the textbook as we go along, or in this case, your textbook packet as we go along. Take a good break. We have a lot more to get through. This was the first big chunk. Take a break, and I'll see you on the other side. Hey, have you dropped the class yet? No? Well, good, because we still have more to go. So I'm glad you are still going to go ahead and join us for the ride for the rest of the class. Let's go ahead and continue into chapter 2. Now, what's important to note in this chapter, it's going to be kind of a tie over from the previous chapter. There is a big difference between the Spanish, French, and British settlements in North America. This chapter is going to be talking about the French and the British settlements in North America. Let's notice the difference in how they are maintained and what they're used for. The also big part of this discussion, we're finally going to bring the British to the New World, but before we can, we got to talk about what's going on in Europe that's going to propel the British all the way out here. So, bit of a complicated, jumbled story, but that's part of the fun. Let's go ahead and dive into chapter 2. Okay, so quickly after the Spanish have some success, and again, it's kind of marginal, but again, using slave labor is going to be pretty successful for pretty much any country. So after after the success of the Spanish colonies, the other European countries are going to get involved. The Dutch get involved, but we're not really going to talk about them because they don't have as big of a lasting legacy outside of the slave trade. We'll get to that later. But really, let's talk about the French. The French actually have a pretty big territory if you consider Canada big and important. The French have a pretty big territory at the start of this story. The thing is, though, the French have a completely different strategy. Whereas the Spanish are looking for quick and immediate gold, and they're going to subjugate the natives once they don't find that gold, and they're going to use the natives as slaves, the French are going to have a completely different tactic. Instead, the French are going to explore the northern regions of North America, mainly in Canada and parts of North America around the Great Lakes. Um, Canada lacked any gold, which is actually kind of ironic because the largest diamond mine in the world is in Canada. We just didn't know it then. Anyway, Canada lacked gold, but was rich in fish and in beaver pelts. I said beaver, not beaver. There are actually going to be a lot of beaver pelts in this region that the French are going to basically use, which is going to be fortunate for them because for some reason, this sounds strange, but wearing beaver pelts and wearing clothes made of beaver skin and beaver fur was really popular in Europe at this time period, and the French are going to basically be the ones that are controlling that fashion trend. In 1608, New France is going to establish itself in modern day Quebec. By declaring Canada a colony, the French sought to keep the other European nations out of their territory. However, they are going to work peacefully with the natives. Through a series of small wars and treaties, the French established a peace and cooperation with most of the natives, mainly because the French don't get in the way of the natives living in this region. The French are not here to subjugate. They're not here to use the Native Americans as labor. The French are purely here to get rid of beavers for their pelts. I know it sounds silly. That's why the French are here. And that's how they're going to control and maintain this colony. They are not interested in actually subjugating the people that live here, which is why the French and the Native Americans pretty much always get along. Again, in stark contrast to the Spanish, who are going to be subjugating and enslaving the Native Americans, the French are going to work well with them and peacefully. Okay, let's finally talk about the British. Next slide. Okay, let's cover what you probably spent 2 weeks on in world history last year in about 3 minutes. Here we go. So, what is going to lead England to come to the New World? There's actually several steps in the process that's going to lead the British or the English, whatever phrase you want to use. We don't care because we kicked their butt in a couple hundred years. So, anyway, what's going to encourage them to come to the New World? Well, it all starts with the Renaissance. The Renaissance or rebirth of Europe occurring in the 14 to 1500s had a side effect: peace. Europe actually goes through a period of peace, which meant countries can focus on economic endeavors rather than just beating each other up and trying to gain more land. However, 75% of the European population were peasants. That in itself is not that big of a problem, but the problem actually is the fact that the number of peasants is increasing. By 1600, Europe had 100 million people living in it, and it had dwindling resources. Whenever resources are scarce, that means the prices for goods and services and land are all going to increase. Peasants obviously cannot afford to exist in such an environment. This is going to lead to a series of peasant uprisings and cultural shifts in Europe. At the same time as that little pot is about to boil over, there's going to be a problem when it comes to religion in Europe. The Catholic Church had dominated the religion in Europe for about 1200 years, but that is about to come to a change. The problems began when the Catholic Church assumed a large amount of power in Europe, and easily so because they controlled who got into heaven. When the Church began taking money bribes for passages into heaven, known as indulgences, um, this is going to really upset a lot of people because the whole idea of paying for passage into heaven basically goes against the teachings of the dude that started the religion. Anyway, backlash over the selling of indulgences led to the Protestant Reformation, which began in 1517. A dude named Martin Luther began a new form of Christianity called Lutheranism, wherein people were not bound to the rules and hierarchy of the Catholic Church. At the same time, the Gutenberg printing press printed a Bible in the common language for a cheaper price. Now, people could actually read the Word of God for themselves rather than needing a priest to explain it to them. Suddenly, the power of religion and hence the power of Europe is going to drastically change because the people did not need the Catholic Church to know God or to figure out how to get into heaven, which again is a pretty good thing if you are a impoverished person living in Europe. Heaven's a pretty cool thing. Everybody wants to go. As soon as this happens, other branches of Christianity begin to form. In France, John Calvin took Lutheranism and changed aspects of it. Calvinists, as his religious followers were called, believed in the supreme power of God and that humans were wicked by nature and needed strict leadership to keep from sin. The cornerstone of Calvinism is this idea called predestination, which means that only so many people would be allowed into heaven regardless of your actions here on earth. However, the Catholic Church does not go away without a fight, and they begin to try to reconsolidate their power. It is in this action by the Catholic Church that compels the people to attempt to flee Europe. Why? How? Well, now, finally, let's look at England to see what's going on. So let's talk about religion in England and see how this could actually start our story. So, Mullen, our story doesn't just start with the British coming to North America and settling colonies. Come on, man. What have the last 40 minutes of this lecture been all about? Fine. I apologize. Okay, anyway, so back to England. So, King Henry VIII, or the VIII, as his friends called him, wanted a male heir, but his wife could not produce one. He wanted a divorce from that wife, that way he could marry someone else who could produce a male heir, even though, really, he has more to do with it than the female. The Pope said no. So, King Henry VIII decided, you know what? Maybe we don't need the Catholic Church here in England. I'm going to make my own church. I'm going to call myself Pope, and I can divorce whoever I want. He called that church the Church of England, otherwise known as the Anglican Church. Yes, this is all a true story. So, he's also going to take over all of the income and properties of the Catholic Church in England and consolidated royal power over religion. He's going to forbade the practice of the Catholic Church in England and forced everyone to become Anglican. Over the next 50 years, each ruler of England forced the people to change their religions to basically match the whim of their current leader. This ended up making a very confusing Anglican church. Sometimes it would be really, really Protestant. Sometimes the church would be really, really Catholic. It kept going back and forth, and it drove people nuts. Specifically, the group of people that were the most upset about the changes that were being made, and a group of people that wanted to go even further away from the Catholic traditions, are going to be a group of people known as Puritans. This group of people were severely moral and self-disciplined, and they wanted stricter rules and punishments, and they wanted England to go away from the Catholic tradition entirely. Eventually, they're going to get fed up with dealing with the Anglican Church and with dealing with the people of England, and these Puritans are going to leave England because of religious reasons. The answer you hear a lot of times in the news or on TV or whatever is that the Puritans leave because of religious persecution. That's not true. The Puritans actually leave because the people in England weren't religious enough. It wasn't that these people were being persecuted because of their religion. It's the opposite. They were being so annoying to everyone else that when they're given the opportunity and the Puritans say, hey, you know what? Maybe we're going to leave. Everyone in England's like, oh, thank God, finally, go, go, go. We're tired of you. Leave, please. And the Puritans are like, we're leaving for religious reasons. Okay, fine, just go, go, go. It's like that, that one friend that shows up and you're like, oh God, it's that guy. And then eventually he leaves and everyone's like secretly excited. If you don't know who that friend is in your friend group, it might be you. We'll get back to the Puritans in a minute. Now let's talk about the first settlements in what is now known as British North America. Okay, we'll get back to the Puritans in a minute, but let's tell what happens in the story of British North America before the Puritan story can actually start. Because the Puritans were not the first British to come to North America. In fact, they're going to come many years later and many failed colonies before the Puritans get here and do everything quote unquote right. Let's talk about some of those early colonies and what's going on here. In 1558, England was seen as a minor power in Europe. Spain and France had the most territory, influence, and were beginning to expand overseas. England is desperately trying to catch up to them. To gain dominance in the region, England's going to have two goals for its colonies. Two goals. One, to find a northwest passage to Asia. It doesn't exist. Well, thanks to global warming, it does now. But, anyway, They also want to raid Spanish fleets and ports along the way to assert their dominance over them. Neither one of those plans is going to be successful. In 1585, the colony of Roanoke, Virginia is established by a dude named Sir Walter Raleigh. It failed miserably and there were no survivors. That's actually not true. Conspiracy theory alert. The uh, the Roanoke colony disappears, but the Native American group, when it's found 30 years later, seems suspiciously less Native American looking. The next generation of that Native American group looks suspiciously a little whiter in hue than normal. The Roanoke colony didn't disappear. It basically just assimilated with the Native Americans. Anyway, it is now the year 1607. The king, realizing that all of these trips to North America is getting expensive, decides to allow these things called joint stock companies to fund trips to the New World. Joint stock companies are basically private funded companies who seeks the king's permission to do something on the land. So the king claims that he owns all this land, but he says, hey, look, if you want to raise the money to go, and then you're going to go and follow all of my rules, I, being a good king, will let you. That's so nice of him, isn't it? You raise all the money, and you can go ahead and do whatever you want so long as you follow my rules. We cool? We cool? We cool. That's essentially what a joint stock company is. One of the first joint stock companies is going to be the Virginia Company, led by Captain John Smith, which is going to found the colony of Jamestown in Virginia. Initially, they were trying to find gold, bring religion to the natives, and secure a passage to India, but pretty much none of those things is going to happen. More importantly, though, the people of Jamestown are going to be given what is known as the full rights of Englishmen and were considered British citizens. So, this is going to be a very important point. Put 7 stars next to this idea. Very early on, it is established that British people who leave Great Britain and come to a colony are still considered British. They're still going to have the same rights of British citizens, even if they don't live on the island. This is going to be a very important point. It's actually a big reason why the entire American Revolution happens, is that idea. It's established that British citizens living in the North American colonies are still going to be given full citizenship rights, even though they don't live on the island. That's super important later. Anyway, a year after the Jamestown colony started, only 38 of the original 105 colonizers was still alive. John Smith is going to reorganize the people and made a much stronger colony. However, when more immigrants came, the colony actually weakened. Of the first 500 colonizers to come to Jamestown, 400 die within the first 2 years. Well, what's going to save this colony? Simple: tobacco. This dude, his name is John Rolfe, is going to observe the Native Americans, making tobacco. So the colony decides to grow tobacco and to sell tobacco to Europe because the Europeans have become addicted to it. Oh yes, the tobacco industry very early on is going to be using the addictions of people to their advantage. Uh, Jamestown is going to quickly go from a fledgling colony where everyone dies to a colony that is going to be basically very rich and very successful, all because of tobacco. Unfortunately, tobacco is a very difficult crop to grow that requires a lot of manual labor. But there are few people here in the New World. So the British have to find a way to encourage more people to come to North America, to encourage more production, and to encourage um, more manual labor to grow more tobacco to make more money. Why not just enslave the natives? There aren't that many natives around, remember? A lot of them are already dead because of smallpox. So we had to find a way to get more Europeans, specifically more British people, over here to do manual labor. We come up with 2 systems to do this. The first one is called the headright system. It goes like this: anyone who paid for the passage of someone else to enter the colony was given 50 acres of land for free. So let's just say that I am going to pay for your passage to North America. You get to come to North America and basically work as an indentured servant. Well, I'll get to that in a second. You basically come to America and kind of work as a slave, but I get free land for paying for your passage. That's actually how a lot of payments are going to happen in North America. You're going to be paid in land because we have a whole metric load of it. Okay, when that ran out and all the rich people had already spent all their money, the king came up with an idea called indentured servitude. This meant that in return for paying for your passage, training, and food in the New World, you would work essentially as a slave for 7 years. So, indentured servants are going to be Europeans, mostly British, but not all, who come to the New World. They're paid to come here as long as they work as essentially a slave for 7 years, and then their passage is paid off. It's these two things that are going to be the start of labor. We're not using African slaves just yet, but America from the very beginning is going to have a labor problem, mainly because the crops that we want to grow, specifically tobacco and later cotton, are very, very labor intensive, and we don't have enough laborers here. The Virginia Company is eventually going to sink deep into debt due to mismanagement and people stealing. That sound familiar? Like every business ever. The colony's population is going to suffer an appallingly high death rate in the early years. By 1624, the Virginia Company was bankrupt, and people were starting to wonder if colonization of the New World was even possible. That is, until another group figures out how to do it right. At the same time as the Jamestown colony is both prospering and failing, a new group of people want to come to North America. Remember that group we were just talking about? The group of people that felt that they were being persecuted for their religion in England? Yeah, the Puritans. Well, in about the year 1620, the Puritans want to come to the New World and they want to establish their own colony, which they're going to call New England. Uh, these settlers, known as the Puritans or the Pilgrims, came to America, settling in Plymouth Bay. Before they landed, they set up what is known as the first legal document in the New World. It's called the Mayflower Compact. It said that the colony would be ruled by a secular, which means non religious, body, establish the separation of church and state, and this idea of majority rule. The idea that everyone in the colony is going to do what the most people agree with, that way they can be successful. Again, all of those sound like very common, simple ideas, but this is where it first starts. This is really the first start of the American ideas, as it were. The Plymouth colony proved to be more successful than the Jamestown one. First, there were far fewer natives, and those that did exist were actually peaceful and helpful for a little while. Second, there was proper management, which fostered better techniques and surpluses, which were traded or sold to the natives for more goods. Third, this colony was not designed to make a profit. This is essentially going to be a settlement colony. And it's actually the religious motives and organization of this region that's going to make it so successful. Why else do they work? Well, the New England colonies are going to be very small at first, which makes them easy to defend in case the natives do go crazy, or, well, justifiably get upset that their stuff is being stolen from them. Next, the British are going to allow anyone to come here. There's going to be no restrictions on immigration. In the Spanish colonies, you had to be from Spain to settle here. In France, you had to be from France to come here. But the British colonies are going to say, hey, you want to come here? You want to follow our rules? You are welcome. Come to our colonies. The British government's also going to have little to no influence over the decisions of what happens here. In Spain, every single decision had to go through the king. So you'd have to sail for 3 to 6 months to come to the New World. There'd be a problem. Somebody would have to sail back for 6 months, ask the king, turn around, come back, and you get your response basically a year later. That's a dumb way of managing the colonies. That's what the Spanish do. The British don't do that. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the Puritans are actually going to come with their families over here to the New World, not just males. The first settlers in the New World were basically men, but the problem with having a bunch of men hanging out, it's very difficult to make more people with just men. So the Puritans and later settlers from New England or from England are going to start bringing over their families. They're going to start bringing over women. That way they can make more children, and children can help repopulate the colonies. It's not rocket science, it's just population statistics. But that's going to be part of what makes the British colonies so successful. Ooh, I'm popular. Let me take a break. So, the dream of these New England or northern or Puritan colonies, whichever phrase you want to use, is really going to be thought up by this dude named John Winthrop. He's going to be, he's a winner. He's going to be the guy that essentially establishes what these Puritan colonies are going to be like. Um, After the initial success of his colony, it's actually going to lead to a huge migration of Puritans into New England. By 1642, 21,000 settlers had come to New England to live in this place called a city upon a hill. Um, when the first Puritans got here, they set up a colony that would be self-governed, under no direct rule from any stockholders or from the crown. Um, Governed by a dude named John Winthrop. He's going to establish something called the model of Christian charity, which is going to define the social and political ideals of this colony. And we're going to get into those as we go here. So I'll come back to those later. He decided he wanted to call Massachusetts a city on a hill that would be a godly community to serve as an example to the rest of the world. The idea being that the rich had an obligation to show charity to the poor, who, of course, were God's favored people. The state should keep the rich from getting greedy and the poor from being lazy. And despite some initial hardships, this experiment's going to work. There were few indentured servants, and there were no slaves in this region. Every adult church member was allowed to vote, and most did. And the colony is going to limit the power of the governor by establishing a legislature that would do checks and balances. So, all these things that we kind of establish as being part of the United States model of government actually start with John Winthrop and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the first Puritan colony. By the way, if you're a nerd like me, you can go and see John Winthrop's grave in Boston, Massachusetts. I went there. Everyone thought I was strange for taking a picture of it, but I went. So, that's a thing. Let's go ahead and talk about what life was like in this colony that he established. The northern colonies are all about religion. Religion's going to be the big driving factor in every decision they make. It's going to be the deciding factor in everything they do, and it's going to be a deciding factor in essentially the identity of these people. Religious leaders were also the colonial leaders in New England, who were voted on by members of the church. Congregations were autonomous, but fears soon rose that would limit the whole idea of Puritan unity in the region. I'll get there in a minute. Ministers established a set of rules known as the New England Way, which strengthened their authority. This meant that you had to read the Bible, so New England was one of the first places to establish the idea of literacy and education. And if you wanted to be part of the church, you had to give a speech in front of the congregation explaining your revelation or experience with God. This is going to lead to a lot of problems with certain people. People aren't going to like the fact that they're going to have to announce their religious conversion in order to be considered a real member of the society here. In fact, let's talk about those people. Roger Williams is going to arrive in 1631, is going to advocate for the complete separation of church and state. I said previously that the Mayflower Compact had essentially said that there was going to be a separation of church and state. Well, the Puritans really weren't so big on that after all. They're going to want the church to control everything. And these people are going to be kind of like spying and stalking each other to make sure no one's breaking any rules. Think of like the most conservative, fundamental, like Christian organization. Everyone's spying on each other, and everyone's convinced everyone else is doing something wrong. Well, that's kind of what Puritan New England looked like, and people like Roger Williams would be like, "Hey, whoa, let's not be. I mean, God is cool and all, but let's not all be all so concerned about that. Instead, maybe we should focus on making sure we all like not starve and die." He thought that it was unfair that the state was punishing people for not paying taxes to a church, and it should not force you to go to church in the first place. Roger Williams is going to be banished from the colony for his views. He's going to move south out of the region with several dissenters. He's going to establish a new land in which you could still follow the rules, but not necessarily the rules of God. He establishes this new place, which was known as Rogues Island, or as we know it today, Rhode Island. Another major dissenter is going to come from a woman named Anne Hutchinson. Puritans believed in the Calvinist idea of predestination. So, Hutchinson argued, why should they judge people or force them to explain their religious experience? Because God's already decided who's going to get into heaven, so why should we have to describe our religious experiences or conversions? Doesn't that mean we're just basically questioning the people that God chose to get into heaven? Aren't we saying we're better than God? Essentially, she's going to cast doubt on the clergy and really on the entire Puritan community. By 1637, Massachusetts had split into two camps, people who supported Hutchinson and people who supported Winthrop. Winthrop, of course, as the governor, is going to put Hutchinson on trial for heresy, which is basically when you talk badly about religion or about God. Uh, she's put on trial, but Hutchinson actually knew the Bible better than the people accusing her of any crime. How could she be a bad Puritan if she knew the Bible better than anyone else? Um, Hutchinson's going to end up being banned from the colony. It's kind of a long story as to why. She's banned from the colony, and she and her followers are also going to leave for New England, or sorry, for Rhode Island. But again, this idea of there's going to be this clash between people that are very, very religious and people who aren't very religious. This is going to be a constant problem in Puritan New England. In fact, let's talk a little bit more about what life is like in Puritan New England. New England settlements were based on the idea of small towns. Each town would have a town center, which of course is the church, would be in the center of the town, and all of the houses would be set in a circle around the church, and the front porch of your house is going to be looking directly at the church. That way, when church services began, everyone could look in everyone else's houses to make sure that every single person had shown up to church. Remember how I was saying it's kind of like a little bit of spying, almost kind of like a little bit like a cult? That's kind of how it was set up. Um, you're constantly being watched to make sure you're following the rules in Puritan New England. Women's rights are going to be limited, but they did have the rights to a divorce in instances of desertion, adultery, or physical cruelty. This was sharply opposite to England, where you had to get an annulment from the church, which was very rare. That being said, women could not own property, so they often married soon after they were widowed. It was common to be married for a woman to be married up to 3 or 4 times in her average lifetime, mainly because women by themselves had no real rights. Economically, the region is very poor because there was very little cash on hand, and there are very few resources that can be exploited or sold in Puritan North America. New England towns were essentially set up on the idea of subsistence farming, the idea that you farm just enough food for you and your community to survive, but that's really it. Mainly because the region of Puritan North America is not really, the soil is not well suited for large scale cash crop farming like the South, and we'll talk about them later. Eventually, people begin to try to establish work in other areas, mainly because there's no money in farming here. The idea of shipbuilding is going to become the new economic factor in New England. The idea of we have to do something else because what everyone else does isn't working is going to lead to a diversification and eventual expansion of New England's economy. New England's going to start out being very poor, but eventually they become very stable and wealthy because they're going to diversify what they do. Unlike the southern colonies, which are entirely based off of slavery, the New England colonies are going to be are going to be based on business and commerce, which is going to make them very healthy. The problem, though, is that this expansion and relative eventual wealth of the colony is going to make it so that way the colony is going to grow and get bigger and bigger, and people are going to get further and further away from the church, which is going to make it harder and harder for the church to have a direct control on people's lives. This is going to hurt the idea of the city on a hill. People began to spread out of these small towns, and they also began to earn more money and to have social classes. When the religiously controlled government tried to limit the prices on goods and services, owners are going to rebel and say they know better than the religious people. The Puritan ethic in New England is slowly but surely eroding. But let's tell the story of what actually makes it really go away. So, what actually kills the Puritan ideal of a city on a hill that is a religiously run colony that's going to be use the principles and words of God to help them run a colony properly. What really ruins this so far pretty successful colony? Teenagers. You guys ruin everything. So, what do they do? What do these teenagers do? Essentially, remember how I said one of the things you had to do was to have a religious conversion or religious revelation that you had to give to the entire congregation? Pretend that we had to do something similar, where every single one of you guys, the first, I don't know, couple weeks of school, had to stand up in front of the entire student body and say how much you love being a bear cat and when you knew you were a bear cat and how wonderful it is to be a bear cat. Like, maybe some of you guys wouldn't have a big problem with that, but I bet a lot of you would be like, why do I have to say I'm a bear cat? Like, I have to go here because I live in the zone that this school is in. Yay? Like, maybe you don't want to. Maybe you don't want to even be a bear cat. Maybe you're forced to be here. I don't know. But maybe you don't want to have to give that kind of a speech to the entire student body. Well, that's how a lot of the younger generation is going to feel about making this religious conversion experience. Their parents were the religious people that came to this region. Maybe they're not as religious. So many of the younger generations not going to want to do this full conversion, which means they're not going to be full members of the church, which means the church is going to have a limited amount of power. The church only has power if people go. If people don't go to a church, it has no power. So this is going to lead to the creation of something called the halfway covenant, which would allow elder church members to baptize their grandchildren into the church in case their actual children didn't want to be members. Um, thereby keeping potential church membership alive. But that's not really going to work either. People in Puritan New England stop going to church. The church is going to have a lot smaller influence over the daily lives of people. And as it has a smaller influence, less people are going to go, which gives it a smaller influence. It's kind of like a snowball effect here. The small community feel of Winthrop's vision began to crumble as well. If the expansion wasn't bad enough for the colony, the natives were not happy about the colonists' expansion. At first, the colonists had little trouble with the natives because so few of them were actually around the coastal region. However, as the colonists start to push westward, they run into Native American settlements. The Massachusetts Bay colonists enacted laws that denied natives rights and refused to allow them to practice their religion within the reach of the colonists. At the same time, the colonists are going to start destroying native habitats and hunting grounds and force many natives to become fur traders, which destroyed the beaver population in the region and forced many natives out of farming. Thousands of natives begin to starve to death due to the mismanagement and treatment by the Puritans. This, along with many other problems, led many natives to forgo their way of life and delve into alcohol and drug abuse, but that's another story. The last major Native American conflict in the region happened in 1675 and was known as King Philip's War. Two-thirds of Massachusetts natives revolted against the colonists, killing over 2,500 of them. The colonists responded with help from Native American tribes, killing 40% of the Massachusetts natives. Essentially, this is going to be the start of a big problem in America. What happens when the British settlement starts to run up against the Native American settlement? At times, they can be peaceful, but there's always going to be an ideological difference between the two. And because of that, there's going to be a lot of fighting. Suddenly, it's not going to be very peaceful here anymore. However, this isn't actually the end of the city on a hill. There's one more story that's left to be told, and it's perhaps the most famous story about the Puritans, the story of the Salem witch trial. The death knell, which of course is a bell that signals death. Anyway, the death knell for the Puritan New England colonies and really the Puritan rule in the region is going to be these Salem witch trials from 1691 to 1693. In 1691, several young girls came into contact with an African slave woman named Tituba, who showed them sorcery. Later, the girls began acting strangely, and people were convinced it was the doing of witches. Uh, Witches were the people whose pride and envy had led them to sign a pact with the devil and away from the Puritan ideal. There was no proof of any actual witchcraft ever taking place, and mostly it was just hearsay about random things that could not truly be proven. By April of 1692, the girls had denounced two locally prominent women. The town was whipped up into a frenzy due to fear, and even the judges with the cases were caught upright in the emotion. Within a year, over 342 people were accused of witchcraft. And, ironically, most of the accusers were young, poor women accusing richer women of witchcraft. Most of the accused had inherited or stood to inherit large sums of money or property. The problem with this and how this became a mass hysteria is that anyone found guilty could lessen their crime if they accused someone else. Um, so it just basically becomes, well, she did this and she did that and she did this. And basically it becomes a mockery of both a legal justice system and really a mockery of people being overly dramatic because of religion. It got so bad that a minister was accused by his own granddaughter. Good times. By late 1692, many ministers began to question if real justice was being done, and by early 1693 they had stopped. This was a sign of religion going too far and was the end of government led Puritanism in New England. Essentially, the idea being that maybe, just maybe, the people were taking their religion a little too seriously, maybe a little too hysterical, and maybe they couldn't really fully be trusted with um, all of this religion. And maybe religion wasn't the thing that was best designed to run the entire colony. Um, New England's not going to go away, don't get me wrong. They're still going to be successful for other regions, but the importance of religion in the region is going to significantly diminish after the Salem witch trials. So that is the northern colony. Now let's talk about the middle and southern colonies in chapter 3, and then we'll be done. Okay, so I hope you guys all took another break, maybe read the textbook, looked at your review questions, answered some stuff. That's good. Now let's compare or differentiate uh, the northern Chesapeake and middle colonies. So essentially what we're going to do here is we just spent time talking about the northern colonies. That's the New England colonies. Remember, they are super religious. Religion controls everything. Now, we're going to meander our way down the British North American colonies and look at what's going on in the middle colonies. Conveniently, they are in the middle of British North America, making it easy. And then we'll finish the chapter by looking at the southern colonies. Each one of these colonies is differently managed and differently run, and it's important for us to understand what those differences are as we are trying to understand really what's going to become the American Revolution. Believe it or not, the American Revolution has its roots. Really, actually, take that back. The Civil War has its roots in how these three regions of North America are initially settled. So we talked about the northern colonies being super religious and having religion and diversified trade control their colonies. Now let's look at the colonies just to the south of them. Let's look at the middle colonies and see what's going on there. This is probably best explained if we look at a picture. So you can see in the upper right here, we have the Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island. Those are going to be the northern colonies or the New England colonies. Now, the middle colonies are New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Again, that might not scream middle to you, but it really is. And then we have the Chesapeake and southern colonies, which of course are along the Chesapeake Bay, or along Virginia, and the southern colonies of North and South Carolina and Georgia, as it is called. So now let's talk about these colonies. Specifically, let's meander our way down to the middle colonies and talk about what they are doing here. So the middle colonies are a mixture of what we see in the entire country, and that kind of makes sense because you have religious colonies in the north. We're going to have slave colonies in the south. I'm assuming you already know that, and of course, in the middle, we're going to have a little bit of both. Um, Whereas the New England colonies had no slaves, the middle colonies have some slaves, and the southern colonies are basically covered in slaves. Okay, that's the difference here. Um, this region is going to be America's first melting pot. It's a place where many different groups are going to come together and experience and have many different types of uh, um, businesses and agricultural growth here. Trying to think of where I want to start this story. Let's actually start this story by discussing one of my personal favorite American colonies, Pennsylvania. It's a really good example of what's going on in these middle colonies. So, uh, Penn's Woods, or as you guys know it, Pennsylvania, was founded in 1681 as a haven for Quakers. Now, Quakers are another religious group, but they're not as hardcore as the Puritans are. So, the Quakers believe in this thing called the inner light, or that the power of God resided in the soul of an individual. This meant that God could inspire any soul to do good or be good. Their church services are a little bit different than what you're probably used to because their church services would be held in complete silence. A bunch of people would get in a room and sit quietly until someone decided to talk. Like seriously, like there's historical evidence of them just sitting there silently for an hour. No one says a thing, and they all get up at the same time and leave. A little bit different take on religion from the uh, northern colonies, which is going to be do this, do that, and we're all spying on you. The the people in Pennsylvania are going to be pretty much the exact opposite. Um, Quakers also refused to take oaths, so that they acted like they were above all law. They're going to give rights to women, and they saw them as religious equals as well. William Penn, the colony's founder, declared Pennsylvania a holy experiment. Hey, look, that truck's around again. Penn promised land, religious freedom, and democracy to anyone that came to his colony. So, what's interesting about the Quakers is that while they are religious, they don't really expect anyone else to. And that's actually a really good way of describing the middle colonies. There are people that want things to go a certain way for them, but they don't care what you do. We're going to do us, you do you, I believe is the phrase that you kids say now. So, you can basically be yourself so long as you don't get in anyone else's way. In fact, to me, this is probably the most America of all of the regions because that's essentially a very American ideal. It's very big on freedom. You do what you're going to do, we're going to do what we're going to do. We cool? We cool. It's a very America attitude. And that's a very big thing about how Pennsylvania is set up. It's no, uh, it's no, like it's obvious to us that this is going to be a region that becomes successful for that very reason. This is part of Penn's holy experiment. Again, he's going to promise land, religious freedom, and democracy to people that come here. Many colonists are going to come with their families, so the colony rapidly grows in size and population and becomes extremely stable. Penn's also going to ask for a executive and legislature for the colony and voting by the people. Essentially, Pennsylvania is going to become what we expect to see from the American colonies. It's going to be a success story, and it's also going to be essentially what America is eventually going to grow up into. We have the northern colonies that are going to be struggling with religion. We're going to have the southern colonies that are struggling with slavery, but the middle colonies are going to be very successful in their own right. Okay, so we've discussed the northern colonies. We've discussed the middle colonies. Now let's discuss the Chesapeake and southern colonies. There's a little bit of a distinction here. Why don't we just call all of this the southern colonies? Well, okay, here's how you can think about it. What we're going to be discussing about the Chesapeake colonies is going to be happening in the deep south, but it's going to be more severe. What do I mean by that? Well, the Chesapeake colonies, and we're going to discuss this, are going to have slavery. They are going to have cash crops, right? Well, those same things are going to happen in the deep south, but they're going to be like amplified. They're going to have a lot more slavery. They're going to have a lot more of other issues going on. So before we talk about the Deep South, let's talk about this region. It's the Northern South. See, it's kind of confusing. Let's talk about the third group of colonies. Let's talk about the Chesapeake Society. Um, Virginia and Maryland are really the colonies that we're going to be discussing for this part of our lecture. And they are the first colonies to really start in the New World, mainly because of the popularity of tobacco. However, life in this region is not ideal. Living in this region is very harsh. Lifespans are short, and society is inherently unequal. Let's start by looking at Virginia. Virginia is going to be heavily influenced by the church in this region as well, but it's not going to be the same as things were in the north. Virginia was established as a royal colony, but is soon going to be allowed more self rule. The people of Virginia are going to set up what's known as the House of Burgesses, which is similar to the House of Representatives in the United States today. They were elected officials who oversaw laws and rules of the colony. Like most early colonies, Virginia is going to have a forced religion on it, controlled by the Anglican Church. All citizens of Virginia pay a yearly tax to keep the church operational. Church attendance was mandatory. However, as time goes on, this region is going to go away from the power of the church and instead is going to decide to be more involved when it comes to self rule. What's life like in this region? Well, tobacco is going to be the main crop grown in this region, but tobacco is going to require a lot of manual labor. And by 1700, over 110,000 English citizens had migrated to the American colonies, many of them to grow tobacco. 80% of those immigrants were male. This led to a huge population disparity in the region. Since few babies were being born, the colonies constantly needed new laborers to be brought in as immigrants. This is actually a good thing for women, ironically, because there's so few of them. They get their genetic pick of the litter, as it were. Um, so, ironically, it's actually a decent thing for women at this time period. And they are going to be given more rights because um, these settlers want to lure in the women to come to their region. So they'll be like, oh, yeah, sure, you can do whatever you want here. It works. Life is hard in this region. Life expectancy is only 48 years for males. 40% of the immigrants die within their first 6 years of arrival to the colony, and most of them come as indentured servants. Indentured servants are supposed to serve for 7 years. Life expectancy is, I mean, they only usually live for about 6, so you never actually get your freedom when you come to the Chesapeake colonies. All right, that sounds positive. Most are going to die from malaria. It wasn't until early 1700 that a new generation of children were born with natural immunities to malaria that allowed the actual population to grow in the Chesapeake colonies outside of immigrants. Unlike northern colonies, which were close knit communities, landowners spread out in the south. The only requirement for the land was to be near a water source, as tobacco requires a lot of water and moist land to grow. The life for indentured servants in this region was horrible, and in many cases worse than what life was like for them as peasants in England. They were often poorly fed or mistreated by their owners, and they were never paid for their service. They were given land after their 7 years, if they lived all 7 years, but the owners had purchased all the best land, and they rarely gave their servants the tools needed to get started as farmers. Because of this, many freedmen, which is what we call a former indentured servant, actually end up going back on the plantation with their former masters to work at a low wage. So they're basically kept in this cycle of poverty, even though they came to the New World to escape poverty. Mullen, U.S. history is full of so many happy and fun stories. How is it you're not constantly depressed every single day when you're teaching this class? I don't know, children. I don't know. Maybe it's because of how the indentured servants are treated. Maybe it's because of the growing disparity between the rich and the poor in the American colonies. Or maybe it's just because Americans like shooting things. But we're going to actually have a rebellion. It's called Bacon's Rebellion. Um, that's going to happen because of these growing internal struggles of America. The political structure in Virginia favored the landed elite. If you had land and you had money, you had power. Not super surprising. Because the rich had taken all the best land, former indentured servants had to go further and further west to be able to farm. Once they did that, they ran into hostile Native American groups. The former indentured servants went to the government and said, "Hey guys, can you protect us? Can you help us? Can we, fight off all of these natives?" And the government refused to help them. These indentured servants were forced to move west for better land. They run into the natives start fighting them. They ask the government for help, and the government says no. Well, because of this, the natives, or the former indentured servants, say, fine, we have to defend ourselves. This dude, his name is Nathaniel Bacon, is going to be a young member of the House of Burgesses. He's going to organize a citizens militia, which is a fancy way of saying he's going to organize a group of guys with guns to go and start fighting the Native Americans themselves. Bacon's militia invaded several Native American villages, killing hundreds. The rebellion eventually dies down because Bacon's actually going to get killed, but uh, it was the first instance of class warfare in the colonies. This would not be the last time that peasant farmers reacted harshly against the government for not listening to them and not supporting them. And that's the basic story of Bacon's rebellion. Bacon's rebellion is also going to make us realize that, you know what, we obviously need some other workers in this region. We need some other ways to guarantee prosperity for whites in this region. We need people to do this very difficult, very labor intensive farming, and indentured servants are not the ones to do it. We have to find some other source of labor. And this is going to become the true legacy of the Chesapeake and Southern colonies. Their legacy is going to be slavery. Even before the class warfare, there's always been a labor scarcity in the colonies. Most of the Europeans who were able or willing to come to the colonies were already here and dead. The colonies had run out of indentured servants to use to make tobacco. A new type of labor was necessary for the British colonies to survive. Slavery is going to develop basically to solve this problem. By 1640, most blacks who were brought into the colonies were seen as slaves for life, and their children are going to inherit their fate. By 1660, slavery was officially recognized as and controlled by the colonies themselves. And by 1705, free blacks were essentially non existent in the American colonies. Slavery came into existence for several reasons in British North America. The first, of course, is this labor scarcity. The second, it was designed to stop class warfare. Slaves were seen as a permanent lower class, and any white, regardless of their income level, was seen as above any black. So you could have a poor, impoverished, illiterate, stupid white person, but they would still be seen in a higher regard than any slave. So having slavery preserved a social hierarchy, as it were, to make whites feel more superior to someone. Finally, uh, there's a change in the products made in the colonies from tobacco to cotton to sugar. All three of these are very labor intensive, very physically demanding, and uh, slave labor is going to be used to do all of this difficult labor that many whites do not want to do. And they can earn a much higher profit having slaves do it and not paying them. The number of slaves in the colonies was initially low until the early success of the Chesapeake encouraged the spread of slavery throughout the British American colonies. Early slaves spent time in West African or other British ports, and most could speak the English language and were accustomed to the British and colonial society. As the demand for slavery grew, more and more captured African males came directly to the colonies without having any time to acculturate like earlier slaves. This had two big effects. There's going to be a language, and the language and culture are going to diverge, which is a fancy way of saying that the slaves that are coming no longer speak English and no longer are part of the British culture in any way. So the slaves that are coming now are straight from Africa, have no experience with English, no experience with British society, and are essentially going to be seen as laborers that aren't going to be communicated with, which means that they're going to be treated worse and worse, especially because they can't communicate with the whites. The growth of slavery is going to lead to the success of the Chesapeake colonies, mainly because all of the hard work now is going to be done by slaves as opposed to whites. Life expectancy, birth rates, and education are all going to increase dramatically in the early 1700s in this region because now slaves are doing the labor that whites used to. Now let's talk about the Deep South, the far southern, otherwise known as the Restoration colonies. Um, While slavery really began in the Chesapeake, it is going to be the most prevalent in the southern plantation colonies. Of the English who emigrated out of the country between 1630 and 1642, 35,000 went to the Caribbean. There, they learned how to run sugar plantations. By 1670, these English settlers had now moved to the deep south of the British North American colonies, and they're going to take this idea of plantation slavery with them and bring it to this region. The Deep South is going to be basically whenever you see slavery depicted in a movie, that is what the far southern colonies are going to be like. Large plantations, large numbers of slaves on these plantations doing backbreaking, physically difficult labor. That's essentially what's going to be going on these colonies. These regions are also very far from any official government control. The British government doesn't come here very often for anything. So there's like very few, if ever, any outside authorities. And there is going to be no real central religious or political authority in this region either. Think about a movie like, I don't know, Forrest Gump, where he has to run a very far distance just to see another house, right? Well, if that's the case, the people that live on these plantations are going to be fiercely independent, and they're not going to like anyone ever telling them what to do, and anyone ever telling them or taking away any of their property. This group is always going to be fiercely independent. That's how they are first established, and that's how they're going to be all the way up to and through the American Civil War. This region is always going to be reluctant to listen to anyone else, mainly because they're all they care about is having their slavery, making their money, and sitting back and drinking their sweet tea. Not to insult sweet tea, it's pretty good, but slavery. Anyway, sugar actually doesn't grow well in the Carolinas, so they need to develop a new product to grow. The answer is actually going to be rice. Now, rice is actually very difficult to grow, um, but you can make a huge profit once you've actually figured out how to grow it successfully. Uh, Indentured servants are not going to be the solution here. You need to actually use a large amount of slaves and a large amount of slave labor to be successful. So African slaves are going to replace these indentured servants, and they're going to replace them by an order of magnitude. We're going to have a significantly large amount of African slaves being continually dropped off to work on these plantations. Slavery is going to explode in the Deep South, with slaves actually outnumbering whites at this time period 2 to 1. And that is actually where we are going to stop our story. Um, let's go to the next slide so I can recap what I really need you to get from this entire summer activity. Ready? Here we go. So the most important things you guys need to get from this activity. If you only really understand 2 major concepts, well, 1, replay the video, but 2, I'll be okay. Ready? Here they are. Number 1, the British, Spanish, and French colonies are all managed differently and have different goals. Okay, so the British North American colonies are going to be managed different than the Spanish and the French. The Spanish colonies are big on gold and exploitation of the natives. Okay, the French colonies are big on trade and beaver pelts and leaving the Native Americans alone. The British colonies are going to be big on actual settlement of this region. The British actually want to settle and populate this region, which is really not the goal of the Spanish or the French. So you need to understand those differences. If you're not sure what those differences are, go back and review your notes. Go back and listen to this lecture again and notice what I'm telling you about the Spanish, the French, and the British and how they manage these regions. Okay, so that's concept number 1. You have to have that concept down. Okay, concept number 2 are how the northern, middle, and southern colonies are all different for various religious, economic, political, and environmental reasons. So in the northern regions, we're going to have regions that are controlled by religion. It's going to be the Puritan North, as I like to call it. The Puritans are going to, in religion, is going to decide what happens. They're going to run the colonies. The colonies do not have a lot of slavery, if any, mainly because the soil is not conducive to growing cotton, sugar, or rice. So in the northern colonies, you're going to have a lot of trade and specifically shipbuilding, and you're going to have the importance of religion. Okay. Now, the southern colonies are going to be large plantations with a lot of slaves doing physical labor to grow cotton, tobacco, and rice and sugar. That's what these regions are going to be growing. They're very autonomous. They don't like the government telling them what to do. They are religious. Don't get me wrong. Religion is still important here, but it's not. Religion doesn't necessarily control the government in the South. Okay, which is much different than the North. Now, finally, this region in the middle is a little bit of the North and a little bit of the South. The middle does have some slavery, but it also has a lot of industry. It does have the influence of religion, but the people there are essentially told, do what you want as long as you don't get in anyone else's way. The middle region is going to become kind of the closest to what America looks like today, um, whereas the North is way more religious than America is today, and the South has a lot more slavery than, well, yeah. So that is our story. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, or more importantly, just hit replay on this video. Please read the assignment, answer the questions completely. Make sure you do not do all of this in one night. It's a lot of work in one night. Use your time wisely. I look forward to seeing you guys all on the first day of school. Have a wonderful summer and be ready for the real story of America to begin and continue. Have a good one, guys.